Namami doubts. Great. Well, welcome everybody to class 5. Everybody can hear me and see me okay? I'm just going to start off my PowerPoint here. I did the wrong thing. Line up fully. Screen. Can everybody online see that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, it just takes 2 seconds to load. It's a big file, so. Sorry. Always difficult with the start of the technology. So welcome everybody to session 5. I hope this has been helpful to this point. And we've got this class and next week's class. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So this is what we've covered to this point. We talked about the life of the historical Buddha. We wanted to swap that, so hold on 2 secs, so that you guys are seeing the full display. Swap display. Great, and let me move this so it's not in the middle of everything. Oh, it's frustrating. Sorry. We've got okay, let me try that again. Such a beautiful day today. I bet people were tempted to skip. Okay. So this is what we've covered to this point. We talked a little bit about the life of the historical Buddha. Oh, that's still in the middle, even though it's minimized. Can I move it? Yes, I can. Can I move the bar up and away? There, that's better. So we've covered at the beginning the life of the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha. Week 2, we talked about main concepts in Buddhism. Week 3, we talked about the branches of Buddhism and how it spread through the world. Week 4, we talked about Shinran Shonin and its innovations. And this week, we're going to talk about the 7 Masters and the 3 Pure Land Sutras. But I'm going to cheat, and I'm only going to cover 4 of the 7 Masters. We'll talk about them briefly, all of them, but I'm going to mainly cover the ones that I think are really critical to Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, and we'll talk about the 3 Pure Land Sutras. But next week, we're supposed to talk about how Buddhism fits into everyday life. And I want some ideas from you guys, so trying to decide what exactly we all want to cover. So some of the things that I thought I would cover, and this is where I want your guys' input, is I do want to do a little bit of meditation. So about a 15-minute session on what meditation is, different kinds of meditation, and how meditation is helpful. Even though meditation isn't really a prominent part of our sect of Buddhism, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, it's something that I think is very worthwhile. And so I think it's worthwhile talking about because it can be incorporated into your everyday life quite easily. Well, maybe not as easy as I think it is, but it's something that you can do in your everyday life, and it can help you, particularly with periods of times when you're stressed or anxious or those kinds of things. So I'd like to do that. I'm going to do a brief session on does Jodo Shinshu make sense to you, and it's actually going to be from my own perspective. So why I think this teaching fits my life, why I think it's something that makes sense for me. And then the other thing that I thought we would do is approach controversial topics like LGBTQ issues, like abortion, like medical assistance in dying. And I thought I would use sort of MAID, medical assistance in dying, sort of as a prototype, as a sort of a guideline that we can look at. How do Buddhists and Jodo Shinshu Buddhists in particular approach this subject, and what would be the conclusions that we would come to in terms of, we support or against it. And I'm going to talk about it from both a general Buddhist perspective as well as a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist perspective. But I do want the last session in particular to be about you guys, right? About what you want to do. So I'm going to open it up to the floor and ask you, and we can do this at the end as well, maybe give you an hour to think about it, but are there other topics, other things that you would like to cover in the last week? So are there some burning questions or areas of discussion that you would like to have? And I'm going to open it up to the online group first. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see that. Let's try to do this, I think. So people online, if you have ideas, you can unmute yourself and put forward any ideas that you would like to talk about in the last session.
I would like to find out what steps you need to take to become a Buddhist.
Oh, okay. What steps to take to become a Buddhist? Okay. That's a good question. Not one that I would have thought of. Any other questions from the online people? Lisa?
Brent and I like the third topic, but we'd like to include it with a bit of 2 and 4.
Yes, so definitely. You mean when we're discussing the topics that I mentioned?
Yes.
Yeah.
We didn't have anything new per se.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll definitely make it more of a discussion rather than me lecturing to you guys. Arlene, do you have any?
Can you kind of explain how Buddhists look at, or Jodo Shinshu Buddhists look at death and the process?
Okay, that's a big topic.
Sorry.
No, okay, I think that's something that we can incorporate.
It's also a topic that we were going to explore more thoroughly in a workshop similar to the Butsudan workshop. It's in discussion right now.
So maybe we can discuss it briefly, but then leave it for that workshop. Is that okay, Art?
That would work for me. No, that's great. Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. And how about here? How do I, Brenda, can you try and minimize? Oh, I think I can do it. Yes, I can. How about here? So what are people interested in talking about? Are the topics that I suggested reasonable? Any new ideas? Any ideas that, David, sorry.
How does Buddhism fit in with a society that has a whole bunch of other religions, like within Lethbridge, for example? As a Buddhist, how do you
Okay.
interact, or I'm not sure what word to use.
So interfaith dialogues, or how do we fit into where the majority are Christian in our, especially in our part of the world?
How should we view their belief system?
Oh. Okay, that could get intense, but
Well, we don't have to cover it.
no. It's, I want suggestions. Okay, any other ideas? Carol, go.
vaccination, vegetarian or veganism, and the environment. And I want to find out about sort of activism.
Activism. I was definitely going to spend some time
like
talking about
political
that.
activism, or, you know.
Yeah, or even environmental activism. Yeah. Because there is a whole huge amount of literature on engaged Buddhism. And obviously I won't be able to go through all of that in detail. But maybe we can talk about why Buddhists should be or could be activists. Okay. Val, you had a...
I was just reading over this document that Sheila had circulated to us from Reverend Akamushi,
Okay.
and he talks about 6 benefits of Shin in ordinary life. And I've never seen those actually documented anywhere, so I would like to know what they are.
Did you send me that article too, Sheila?
I did. That was after that, that BCA thing that I was working on.
Oh, okay. Can you send it to me again, just in case I don't have it?
It's just that it's
Sure.
membership and publication.
Yeah, maybe I'll photocopy that after the talk. Any other ideas? Any other topics? You guys are willing to spend a week next next session?
Sounds like
No.
an all-day thing.
I mean, I think we can talk about an approach to some of these things too. Maybe not covering in detail any of the specifics, but I think we can definitely talk about an approach.
Roland, could you include something about the Buddhist response to the wars and to the refugee and the immigration status of people just in general?
Okay. And I might actually pick a Jodo Shinshu approach to it, because the book that we're reading right now has a chapter specifically on that. So,
Lisa and Brent have a question.
go ahead, Guy.
I just wanted to say we're enjoying all of the suggestions. We're going, yeah, that's a good one. But also maybe if it's a possibility to, instead of just glazing over it, to have another, I don't know, video session like this again, because more specific things like the workshop that Arlene mentioned with the tribes and the activism, engaged Buddhism. I don't know, I'm quite interested, and thank you so much for these suggestions, everyone.
Yeah.
I have a suggestion. We might be able to do chapter studies of various authors because Jeff Wilson Sensei has an excellent book out on living Nembutsu, and he covers a lot of these topics.
Yeah, he really does. And there's 3 of us who are involved in that book club right now. But I think that would be definitely a worthwhile thing to go over. So that book of Jeff Wilson's is really a very practical approach to how to apply Buddhist and specifically Jodo Shinshu ideals to everyday life. So we'll definitely talk about that.
What's the title of that book, sir?
Living Nembutsu.
Do we still have copies left?
2 seconds. No, we don't. We gave them all out, which is a shame in some ways. So this is the book, Living Nembutsu by Jeff Wilson. You can get it on Amazon. We had a number of copies that we gave out to people. And we have 2 copies in our library, but I'm using one for my book study, and then the other one someone has taken out as a loan. So, but maybe we can talk about that. That might be worthwhile replicating. And the other thing is that Jeff Wilson is actually coming to Calgary in May. I can't remember the date. I think it was like the 25th or 6th?
Yeah, Saturday.
A Saturday.
Yeah.
And if you haven't heard Wilson Sensei, he is a professor of religious studies at an associated university with the University of Waterloo. He is a prolific writer. I think this is his 8th or 9th book. And he has a really good way of approaching Buddhism from a practical, everyday standpoint. He can put difficult concepts into easy to understand language. He can also teach in an academic level, but he really, if you read this book, it actually is, he has a number of books on Jodo Shinshu in particular, but it's quite helpful. Yeah, so it's called Living Nembutsu, Applying Shinran's Radical Engaged Buddhism in Life and Society by Jeff Wilson. So,
Who told you that all those free copies we were given?
the Living Dharma Center, the national organization, gave us, I think it was 10 copies, or maybe even 20 actually. And so when they came, we thought, oh, it'd be really good for people to have them. So people received them and gave back a donation. Okay, so is it okay if we go on with the topic at hand? So thank you very much for that input. I will see what I can do in trying to make sure that we cover as many of these ideas as possible. It was a really comprehensive list, so I probably won't be able to cover everything, but maybe we can talk about what we can do to sort of approach these subjects in the future too. Okay. So today I want to talk about 2 things. One is the 7 great patriarchs, 7 masters as they're called. We're talking about who they were, what their writings were, what they contributed to general Buddhism, and what they contributed to Pure Land Buddhism in particular. And then we're going to talk about the 3 Pure Land Sutras. So these are the main... Hello? Sorry?
You have to share screen, please.
Oh, I thought I was on share screen. What were you seeing?
Gallery view.
Sorry. So we're going to talk about the 3 Pure Land Sutras as well.
And can you make sure that you did original sound when you share that?
So say that again, Brenda.
Make sure that you check off original sound if you're going to use the bell.
Okay, but that means I have to go back out again. Can you? Oh no, I think it has to be my device that does that. All right, sorry. I think it was on original sound, but I'll just double check. I'm just going to assume it's on original sound, Brenda. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 3 Pure Land Sutras as well. So the short abbreviations are the largest sutra, the Contemplation or Meditation Sutra, and the smaller sutra. But we'll talk specifically about those and what each one actually talks about. So first question, who are the 7 masters? Does anybody know any of the 7 masters? And who decided these are our 7 masters? So can anybody name any one of them?
Nagarjuna.
Nagarjuna, number 1, yeah. And he's actually my favorite of the 7 masters. I mean, you're not supposed to have favorites, right? But I like him because his contribution to Pure Land Buddhism was the easiest for me to understand. So that's the reason why. So who picked the 7 masters? Were they just random? Was it picked from Shinran Shonin? Right. So the idea in Buddhism, from the very start of Buddhism, was that you had to have a lineage of teachings and teachers. So the teachings were passed on from a master to a student, masters to student, master to student, on through the ages. And most, I think all sects of Buddhism, all schools of Buddhism, have their own particular lineage. And so whoever starts that school basically makes a decision, okay, these are the important people in our history that evolved our teaching. And so Shinran Shonin, the master, the founder of our school, he picked the 7 masters. And you would think that because Honen, we talked about Honen a little bit in the past and talked about him a little bit more today, was Shinran's teachers, you would have thought that Honen's 7 masters would be the same as Shinran's. But they're actually quite different. Right? So 4 of the masters that Shinran picked are the same as Honen's, but Honen had several more. So it was Shinran who made the decision, okay, these are the guys that we're going to really focus on. And we're only going to focus on 4 out of the 7 today. Okay. So this is a picture of our scroll on our altar, on our Naiji. And that picture, the scroll, actually shows the 7 masters in order, right? So there were 2 Indian masters, there were 3 Chinese masters, and there were 2 Japanese masters. The Chinese and Indian masters have 2 different names. They have their original names, so if they were from India, they had their Indian names, but also they have been given Japanese names because the Jodo Shinshu, the people in Japan, found it hard to say Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu, and so they gave them Japanese names. And similarly with the Chinese masters, they found it difficult to pronounce some of the names, so they gave them Japanese names as well. So the Indian and Chinese masters have both the original names plus a Japanese name, and of course the 2 Japanese masters, they didn't have to rename them because they already had Japanese names. So those are the 7. So the first one is Nagarjuna that Margaret mentioned, and he was a master in India, and we'll talk about him. Vasubandhu was the second of the 7 masters, and we're not going to talk about him, although he was quite significant in terms of the development of Mahayana Buddhism in particular. The first of the Chinese masters, a fellow by the name of Tan Luan, and we won't talk about him, but we'll talk about the second of the Chinese masters, who is Tao Chou, and we'll talk about his contributions. The most prominent of all of the 7 masters, I would say, is probably a fellow by the name of Shantao, or in Japanese, Zendo. Okay? And so we'll talk about him a little bit more. He was really prolific in his writing, and he had many, many novel ideas that he contributed both to general Buddhism, but specifically to Pure Land Buddhism. So we'll talk about him. We won't talk about Genshin, the first of the Japanese masters, but we'll talk about Honen, mostly because he was Shinran Shonin, our founder's teacher. Right? So we'll talk about him. So as I go through the 4 of the 7 masters, the rest of the information is in the handouts that I gave you. So there is more details about particularly the masters that we're not going to talk about. So if you want to, or if you want other reading material, I can certainly find some for you. And what I thought we would do is go through the history of that master, what they contributed. Then I have the writings from a chant, a sutra chant called Shoshinge, Shoshin Nembutsuge. So it's a chant that we commonly do at our temple. And I'm just going to read this, or have someone read the section from Shoshinge that talks about that master. So Shinran wrote Shoshinge, and it's a summary of the teachings of Pure Land Buddhism. And in it, he has 2 or 3 paragraphs about each master. So we're just going to read that, and then I'm going to chant that section in the Sino-Japanese for you guys. That's okay. Is that okay? So we'll see how it works. So Nagarjuna, his Japanese name is Ryuju, okay? And it's actually a transliteration of Nagarjuna. It was a shortened transliteration of Nagarjuna, and it's Ryuju. He was alive in the 2nd century, And it's interesting because if you read the sutras from the original Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, he's the only of the masters that Shakyamuni Buddha said, this guy is going to come around at this time. Right? So Shakyamuni Buddha actually named Nagarjuna and said he would be around 600-700 years after I die. Actually, he said 600 years. So he was off by a few hundred years or so. And he is felt to be one of the founders of the Mahayana sect, the Mahayana branch of Buddhism, right? And he's best known in general Buddhism for his whole concept of emptiness, the teaching of sunyata, or emptiness. He wrote something called the Juju Bibashiron, and that is the discourse on the 10 stages of the Bodhisattva path. So the other thing that Nagarjuna is really quite famous for is this whole concept of the Bodhisattva path, the path where you become enlightened, but you put off your ultimate enlightenment to come back and help all other sentient beings. So he was really the first one that emphasized that. And his major writing was on, well, what are the steps to become a bodhisattva? For Pure Land Buddhism and Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, he described something called the easy path and the difficult path, right? So he said that the path where you meditate, you practice, you try to become enlightened yourself is the difficult path. It's hard. It's like going from here to Banff on foot, right? So that's how he compared it. Taking a long journey on foot, overland. Whereas the easy path, he said, is the Pure Land path. The Pure Land path is one where you recite the Nembutsu, you say the Buddha's name, and you put your trust in the Buddha. And that, he felt, was the easy path. So he distinguished those two paths. And the difficult path was mostly the Theravadan path, right? So the older school of Buddhism, where you really had to become a monastic, you had to give up your secular life, you had to practice for eons, 10 kalpas, 20 billion years, and then you could become enlightened. Where he said the easy path was a path for us, for the everyday person, the person who couldn't become a monk and give up their secular life. It was a path that you didn't have to meditate and dedicate eons to becoming a Buddha. And so that was his major contribution to Pure Land Buddhism, the idea that there was this easy path, Pure Land path, and a difficult path, more the Theravadan path. Okay. There is a connection to Harry Potter with Nagarjuna. I just thought that was interesting. So Nagara is actually snake or serpent or dragon. It's the Indian version of that. And does anybody remember someone or with
Nagini.
Yeah, Nagini. Yeah. So the Nagini, the snake, Voldemort's snake was named Nagini, and it comes from the same derivation, right? So this Nagi is the female version, Naga is the male version of that. So he was actually the bodhisattva of the snakes or serpents. Anyways. So the question to you guys is we've talked a little bit about the bodhisattva path, this path where you don't just seek enlightenment for yourself, but you put off your ultimate enlightenment to help all other beings. How do you think that was revolutionary for Buddhism? Because Nagarjuna is really the first one that emphasized that path. How do you think that changed the way that Buddhism was practiced or approached? Any ideas?
Difference between selfish and selfless.
Selfish and selfless. That's excellent. Yeah, David. So that, I think, really encapsulates it. In Jeff Wilson's book, he talks about the change of Buddhism over time from a practice of me or I, so focusing on just yourself, to focusing on the they, which is really the bodhisattva way of approaching things. So I'm going to become enlightened, and then I will help everybody else. So I will help them. Okay? And then the third change is an approach to we. So we all suffer together. We all seek enlightenment together. We all entrust in the Buddha. And that's more of a Jodo Shinshu way of thinking about things. But there was definitely a major change in the thinking of general Buddhism from thinking about yourself and trying to become enlightened for yourself to wanting to help others. So compassion became, or generosity became a very big virtue. Any other comments about that? About how you think, do people believe that the Bodhisattva path actually exists? Yeah, I mean, I think it really did change Buddhism from an approach of being inclusive, of encompassing other people. Okay, so this is going to be difficult if I can get rid of this. Great. This is actually what was written, the English translation of what was written in Shoshinge, Shoshin Nembutsuke. And so I'm going to get someone to read that for me. So this is what Shinran talked about for Nagarjuna. Okay. So does anybody want to volunteer just to read that if you can? Sure, Sheila, thank you.
Like both paragraphs?
Yeah.
Nagarjuna, the Mahasattva, would appear in the world and completely rend the views of being and non-being. He would express the highest dharma of Mahayana, attaining the stage of joy. He would be reborn in the land of peace and bliss. He disclosed that the difficult practices are toilsome, like walking on land, and urged us to believe that easy practice is pleasant like sailing on water.
Yeah, so that actually encapsulates most of what Nagarjuna means to the Pure Land Buddhists. So he was the one who started the Mahayana path. He was the one who talked about the difficult and easy practices. Yeah. So I'm going to chant that for you. This is how we would chant it in Japanese, Sino-Japanese. Shaka nyorai ryoga sen ishu go myo nan tenji ryuju daiji shuto se shitsu no zaiha umu ken senzetsu daijo musho ho shokan giji shoanna. So that's basically, I chanted basically the translation that's there. And I don't know if anybody caught it, but in the third verse of third line, I said Ryuju Daiji. So that he's specifically named Ryuju. That's the Japanese name of Nagarjuna. So if you go through Shoshinge, you can actually, there's an English translation at the bottom of all of the sutras, but you can actually pick out their names and what their contribution was to Buddhism, and Jodo Shinshu in particular. And that's a picture of Nagarjuna. Okay, we're going to skip Vasubandhu, and we're going to skip Tanluan. Tanluan's name in Japanese is Donran, just out of interest. And that's a picture of Tanluan. He's the first of the Chinese masters. But the second of the Chinese masters, a fellow by the name of Tao Cho, or Doshaku in Japanese, Doshaku. And he was alive in 562 to 645 AD. And he followed a different school of Buddhism until he discovered the writings of Tanluan. He's the one who invented the Nenju. Okay, so the rose, it's like a prayer beads, some people call it, but this is called a Nanju. And he's the person who came up with this idea. And the whole idea of the Nenju or Ojutsu is that saying or reciting the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, was felt to be very important. And saying it many, many times was felt to be very important. So he actually used this to count how many times he had said the Nembutsu. And it said that he averaged 10,000 times, over 10,000 times a day, which is a lot. But he used this specifically to be able to count the numbers of times he said Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. His major work was something called Andakushu, and he described two things. That he clarified what Nagarjuna said about the difficult path and the easy path. And he said the difficult path was the path of the sages, particularly labeling as the path that Theravadan Buddhists followed. And he said the easy path are what particularly Pure Land Buddhists followed. So the path where we entrust in the Buddha. And The second thing that he talked about and really highlighted, even though this was known before, he really emphasized that we were in the age of Mappo. And I'm going to explain that a little bit. So the Buddha originally described that there was going to be 3 time frames, 3 time periods with the Buddhist teaching, right? So the 3 time periods are the right Dharma age, the second is the semblance of the Dharma age, and the last one is the last Dharma age, or the age of Mappo. So the right Dharma age, the first age, actually happened after the Buddha died, or when he was still alive, until about 500 years after he died. And what the Buddha said is, during that time, my teachings will be very lively. People can hear about my teachings everywhere. It's easier to practice. You had a Buddha that gave you an example, and it was relatively easy for people to become enlightened during that time. It's a time where people, he said, many people, many of my disciples and others will become enlightened. Okay? So that's the first 500 years during the Buddha's life and for 500 years after that. And then he said there's going to be a second age. It's called the semblance of the Dharma age. So he said, I have been dead for 500 years now. During this time, it's going to be much more difficult to really hear the true teachings of the Buddha, the true Dharma. And it's going to be difficult to obtain enlightenment. But rare people will still be able to become enlightened. So the next 500 years, he said, it's a semblance of Dharma age. It's the time when the messages is going to be diluted. It's going to be hard for people to practice. It's going to be hard for people to gain enlightenment. There'll be a select few of you who will be able to do that. And then the last of the Dharma ages is the Mappo, age of Mappo, or the last Dharma age. And he said that's going to last for 10,000 years. Okay, so 500 years, right Dharma age, 500 years, semblance of Dharma age, and then the last 10,000 years, Mappo. And he said during Mappo, my message is going to be very diluted. It's going to be really hard to hear the teachings of the Dharma. It's going to be almost impossible to practice diligently, and almost nobody will be able to gain enlightenment during this time of Mappo, during their time. Right? So he said there were 3 distinct ages, and when people analyze the time frames that he was talking about, Taucho was the one that said, if we're not in Mappo now, we're getting very close to the age of Mappo. And the Buddha also described what would be happening around the time of Mappo, that there would be famines, epidemics, all of these kinds of things, wars. And so Taucho or Doshaku said, I think we're actually in the time of Mappo, the time of the last Dharma age. And because it's 10,000 years, that means that we're in the time of Mappo now too, right? Because it's not been 10,000 years. So this is what's in the Shoshinge about, do you mind reading that?
I can't see it very well.
Oh, sorry.
Actually, because of
Yeah, because of your angle. Asha, do you mind?
Doshaku ascertained that Bodhi is difficult to attain by the path of sages, clarifying that the Pure Land path alone is possible for us. He disparaged the practicing of thousands of good deeds with self-power and encouraged the exclusive utterance of the name consummated with perfect virtues. He compassionately led the men in the ages of the semblance Dharma, the decadent Dharma, and the extinct Dharma as well.
Right. So I talked about the right Dharma age, and the Mappo. That's what the last paragraph is talking about, the 3 Dharma ages. And he tried to lead men through all those 3 ages. Yeah. Okay, so I think and that's a picture of him. So, question for you guys is, do you believe we're in the age of Mappo? Do you think that we're in a time of decadence and where it's hard to hear the teaching of the Buddha? Yeah.
It's pretty easy to believe that. Just look around. But it's just so different from the Christian attitude that
that their Bible is a holy and forever document, and their teachings are holy and forever, without that there hasn't been this gradual, well, not even gradual, there hasn't been this shift in culture over the years that it affects that. So I know I found that really hard to kind of accept, that the Dharma that we're getting isn't the pure Dharma.
And it's partly because of time, and it's partly because the message gets diluted and corrupted over time. But yeah.
And it's been translated to get to us in English. It's been translated through many languages as well.
And who knows how accurate those translations are? Yeah. Any other comments about the age of Mappo? It's interesting because the Pure Land Buddhists took this concept of Mappo, that basically no one's going to be able to gain enlightenment, and they said, okay, well, if we're really in this time of Mappo, then really the only way that you can gain enlightenment is to rely on the compassion of the Buddha. All of us can't gain enlightenment for ourselves because we're in a time that's corrupted, because we're egocentric, because we have our three poisons, all of that. And it was the Pure Land Buddhists who said, and therefore we have to rely on the compassion of the Buddha to help us to become enlightened or to gain birth in the Pure Land. Okay. The next person I'm going to talk about a little bit more is Shantao, or Zendo is his Japanese name. He was around 613 to 681. He was a direct student of Tao Cho, the fellow we talked about before, and he wrote prolifically. He has so much writing that it's almost impossible to encapsulate all of what he wrote. For Jodo Shinshu, or Pure Land Buddhists, so his major writings that we focus on is his interpretation of the what they call the Contemplation of the Meditation Sutra that we're going to talk about. So he went through the Meditation Sutra and wrote many commentaries on it, and he said this is what it means, and this is why we should venerate it, and this is the important messages from it. But his final conclusion is that the Contemplation Sutra was written so that we can focus on reciting the Nembutsu and entrusting the Buddha as the primary message from that sutra. And so we're going to talk about the Contemplation Sutra in a little bit, so I won't go over that in detail. Margaret, do you think I could get you to read what's in Shoshinge about Zendo, and then I will chant the Zendo part.
Zendo was the only one who clarified the Buddha's real intent, pitying those who practice the meditative and non-meditative practices and those with deadly sins and evils. He revealed that the light and name are the cause and condition for birth, and led them into the great wisdom ocean of the original vow. And then when the aspirant receives the diamond mind in harmonizing with his mind, through the single thought of joy he shall obtain the three insights, as did Vaidehi, and realize eternal bliss of Dharmata.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the Meditation Sutra and the story about Queen Vaidehi, but really what is written in Shoshinge is a summary of what Zendo did. So I'm going to chant that part if you guys don't mind, because I like chanting this. Zendo udoku myobu So you could hear his name, Zendo, right at the beginning. And so, again, 2 paragraphs out of Shoshinge talk specifically about Zendo or Shantao and what he contributed. And that's a picture of Zendo. And we're going to skip Genshin and go on to Honen. His other name is Genku. So Genku or Honen was Shinran Shonin's master teacher. Right? He was originally a Tendai monk, and like Shinran, he left the Tendai monasteries and found out about Pure Land Buddhism, and he taught about Pure Land Buddhism. When he was young, it's said that at the age of 9, he actually witnessed his father's death. And his father in his last breaths, told Zen Genku or Honen, don't seek revenge. Forgive those who have killed me, because revenge only leads to more violence, right? So that was one of the messages that Honen's father gave him. So it was from that he decided to become a monk at the age of 9, just like Shinran. His major work is something called Senjaku Hongan Nembutsu, or the passage on the selection of the Nembutsu. And he established something called the Jodo Shu sect. So it's the first major Pure Land school in Japan, right? And Jodo Shu still exists today. And he was the one, and we're going to talk about the 18th vow when we talk about the largest sutra, but he said, out of all of the sutras written by the Buddha, the largest sutra is the most important, and out of the largest sutra, the 18th vow or the primal vow is the most important. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. He popularized Buddhism to the common person. So Buddhism at that time in Japan was really for the elite or the monks and nuns, right? So it was felt that the common everyday person really couldn't access Buddhism, whereas he brought it down to the level of the common person. And I think I talked about in Shinran about the persecution of Honen and Shinran, that 2 or 4 of his disciples were actually killed by or executed, and that he was sent into exile, right? But the major thing is that he was Shinran Shonin's teacher. Heather, do you mind? Can you read that?
Genku, master of the sect, well versed in Buddhism, pitied ordinary foolish men, whether good or evil. Spreading the teaching of Shinshu in the far-off islands, he propagated the selected original vow in this evil world.
Yeah. So that's what Honen was famous for. The most important thing for us is that he was Shinran Shonin's teacher, and that's again a scroll painting of Honen. So then I thought I would shift over to the 3 Pure Land Sutras. And so these sutras were picked by various masters, but particularly by Honen, Shandao, and Shinran, as the 3 main sutras that we should be focusing on, the 3 main teachings of the Buddha. So the first one is called the Larger Skavati Vyuha Sutra, or the Larger Sutra for short. Skavati is the Pure Land. That's the name for Amida's Pure Land. The second one is called the Meditation Sutra, and the third is the smaller Skavati Vyuha Sutra, or Amida Sutra. So we'll go over these really quickly. So the largest sutra, there's various names. In Japanese, it's called Bussetsu Muryo Jukyo, or Daikyo, larger sutra. And in English, the translation is the Sutra of the Buddha of Immeasurable Life, the Sutra of Amida Buddha. Okay. So this sutra, all the sutras are sort of set up in a similar fashion. So the beginning of the sutra, it describes where the sutra was given, who it was given to, and who was around. So if you actually read this sutra, the first quarter of it is a description of the setting, who was around, what Buddha's bodhisattvas, who listened to this sutra. It was delivered by Shakyamuni Buddha on Vulture's Peak. And the whole sutra basically comes down to a story of this king called Dharmakara. So this king Dharmakara looks at the suffering of the world and says, I want to become enlightened to help all beings, right? And so he gets advice from various Buddhas, and the various Buddhas tell him, in order to become truly enlightened, you have to do a number of things. You have to try and set up your Pure Land. So all Buddhas have their own Pure Land, by the way. And so his Pure Land is called Skavati. And during the process of him trying to become enlightened, which took 5 kalpas or 21 billion years, it is said that he actually made 48 vows. And he said, I will fulfill these 48 vows, and when I fulfill them, I will become an enlightened Buddha, right? So it's really just the story of this Dharmakara, this King Dharmakara, who practices for many eons and ultimately becomes this Buddha that we call Amida Buddha, right? And so the larger sutra actually contains all of his 48 vows. And of those 48 vows, the one that Jodo Shinshu Buddhists focus in on is this one, the 18th vow, or what we call the primal vow. Okay, so the 18th vow says, and all of the vows are written in double negatives. So if this does not happen, then I won't attain Buddhahood, right? Which is kind of a complex way of stating something. And I don't know why they were stated in double negatives, but that's the way they are. So it's the 18th vow says, if when I attain Buddhahood, the sentient beings of the 10 quarters, all of the world, who with sincere and entrusting heart aspire to be born in my land, and say my name even 10 times, and some people have shortened it to say even 1 time, and some people even shorten it to say even think of my name, should not be born there into the Pure Land, may I not attain the perfect enlightenment. And then he has an exclusion clause. Excluded are those who commit the 5 great offenses and those who slander the right Dharma. So there's 2 important components of this vow. The first is that people should have a sincere and entrusting and aspiring mind, okay? And that's what Shinran focuses on. He says the entrusting mind and heart is the most important. But the other component of this vow is think of or say my name 10 times. So that was what many other Pure Land Buddhists focused on, is saying the name. That's why the Nembutsu, saying Namo Amida Butsu, the name of the Buddha, is so important. Because in this vow it said, if you say my name or think of my name even once, then I will guarantee you'll go to the Pure Land, right? And the interesting thing is the way that he worded it. He said, if this does not happen, I will not become the perfect Buddha. But the irony is that he did become the perfect Buddha. There's lots of evidence that says that through the sutras that he gained perfect enlightenment. He became the perfect Buddha, right? And so it's kind of like, if this doesn't happen, then I won't attain it, but you've already attained it, so it must have happened, right? So this is considered the most important vow for Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. The 18th vow, or the primal vow, again, the focus is on either having an entrusting heart and mind, shinjin, what we call, or saying the name. Even reciting or thinking of the name once will guarantee you birth in the Pure Land. Okay. Sorry. So I want to talk a little bit about the exclusion clause. So it says, excluded are those who commit the 5 grave offenses. The 5 grave offenses are killing your mother, killing your father, killing an arahat or a Buddha, injuring a Buddha, or causing disharmony in the Sangha. So the first 5 are things that are basically impossible, well, very difficult for us to do. So I don't think anybody has killed your mother or your father in this room, haven't hurt a Buddha or a arahat, because there's no Buddhas or arahat alive, so it's hard to do that. But causing disharmony in the Sangha, I've done it, so it's relatively easy to do. And so the Buddha specifically said, well, you can't do any of these things. But people have actually interpreted to say, okay, the Buddha mentioned these because these are things that you should really try to avoid. At all costs, don't do these things. But the understanding from especially Jodo Shinshu Buddhism is that even if you commit those 5 great offenses, if you say the Nembutsu or if you have a trust in Amida Buddha, then you will be reborn in his Pure Land. So it's kind of like a caution, but even if you do those things, it's okay. You're accepted the way you are. So that's the primal vow. I won't go through all 45 vows, but just to say that the larger sutra actually has a couple of vows that historically have been problematic. So many of the other vows talk about the Buddhas will all say my name from the 10 quarters and all those kind of things. But the 35th vow is the one that people have the most difficulty with, and I'm going to read that. When I attain Buddhahood, the woman throughout the countless and inconceivable Buddha worlds in the 10 quarters, having heard my name, will rejoice in entrusting heart, awaken the mind of aspiring for enlightenment, and wish to renounce the state of being a woman. Okay. If after the end of their lives they should be reborn as a woman, then I will not attain the perfect enlightenment. So basically he's saying that women, well, one interpretation I should say, women need to be reborn as men and then they can gain enlightenment, right? Now, when people read this, many people are very offended, right? They say, what a misogynistic religion this is. Like, how can we say that you have to be reborn as a man, that being a woman isn't good enough? And the interpretation over time has been that it really wasn't meant to discriminate or exclude women. In fact, at that time, it was many sects of Buddhism firmly believed that women cannot become enlightened. And it's said that by including this vow or this clause, the Buddha Dharmakara was trying to be more inclusive, that this was a possibility that women could. Margaret showed me this other interpretation of the 35th vow, and this is a much better version of it, I think, because it excludes the fact that women have to be reborn. So when I attain Buddhahood, the women throughout the countless inconceivable Buddha worlds, in the 10 quarters, having heard my name, will rejoice in entrusting heart and awaken the mind, aspiring for enlightenment. Should it not be so, may I attain the perfect enlightenment. So this version of it excludes that clause about have to be reborn as a man. Okay. In a similar way, the 41st vow talks about those with physical disabilities. So it infers that people with physical disabilities, too, will have to be reborn without those disabilities, and then they can gain enlightenment. But again, the intent of it really was to try and include people with disabilities. And the interesting thing is that if you actually look at the Buddhist teachings, because of the idea of rebirth, it said that all of us have been women at some point, have been disabled at some point, have been animals at some point. And so really the Buddhist teaching should encompass everybody, that everybody has the potential to become enlightened. So what do people think about the 35th and the 41st vow? I'm going to ask you, Margaret, first, because you've read a fair bit about it.
I think, well, the translation that we have in a book at home, that translation that I provided is good, and apparently it's a translation of that somebody had made from the original writings. But the other way is just really quite offensive, and I don't see how it can be walked around to say, well, I'm really trying to include you guys. I don't see that. I just see that that women have been forever, shunned and told they weren't good and that type of thing.
It partly comes from the time in history and the fact that Buddhism came from the Indian culture. So the Indian culture definitely believed in castes of different levels of beings, and definitely had the teachings that a woman should be subservient to their husband, the father, their husband, and their son, in that order. So it's partly cultural, partly the time that these writings came from. But there is a movement afoot that says, we should try to adopt different versions of these vows, that we shouldn't, in this day and age, have these as our writings. Heather, you're going to say?
I have more of a problem that, okay, we've been men, women, and animals, but in one of our previous sessions, most of the people in the room didn't believe in reincarnation.
Right. Okay. Sure. So, so how to approach this idea if we don't believe in reincarnation? I think the way that most modern scholars would interpret it is that it's just a reflection of the time. It's just a reflection of the culture and the time, and that really it's not a central part of the teachings. David?
I think there's a disclaimer that overrides any of this stuff. These are all rules that are made by men in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing the Buddha said is, have a healthy, these are my words, have a healthy disrespect for bureaucracies
Right.
that build up, and make sure that it appears to be reasonable to you.
So the Buddha's last words before he died was, make yourself the light, right? So the idea is, don't listen to a teacher, don't listen to doctrine blindly, but take on this information for yourself and interpret it yourself. It has to fit you, your life.
I think that in that time, the only way those doctrines would have been acceptable to the general population, including the male priests, is if he had worded it in that way. So to me, it's more of a way to get women accepted, to get the disabled accepted. But in that time, that's the only way it could be approached.
Right. So the question that I would have is, can you change a major component of your writings? Like it would be like changing, something out of the Bible, because it doesn't fit our times.
Or the Quran.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a recurring problem with literal translation of those documents.
Yeah.
When they don't fit the times.
The times, right? Don't fit our belief systems anymore. So is that okay? Is that good? And of course, different scholars have different ideas about that. Some people believe, and Jeff Wilson is certainly one of them, that says that these kinds of scriptures need to change to fit the environment that they're in, the times and the culture that they're in. And many Buddhist scholars in Japan believe that, but then there's the orthodox view that no, this is the way it was written, we've got to keep it this way. You can't change the interpretation. Yeah.
The words themselves have evolved completely opposite. If you study language like Japanese,
Yeah.
Calming, the character for it was noise at one point, and now it's, the serenity.
Yeah.
That sort of thing has happened over the times too.
Right. So just, this is sorry, Alan.
It's saying, but originally, like through the ages, like Pali, Sanskrit to India, Chinese, Japanese, and we then interpreted to English. What the words or ideas, like my pet peeve is evil. Well, evil to us did not mean evil to the Pali language. So I think have to take it with a grain of salt and consider that aspect of change.
Yeah. So interpretations, translations, they can all change the original intent or meaning.
Speaking of interpretations, sometimes I think it's not necessarily a language barrier, but a perception barrier.
Sure.
So a lot of the books that I've been reading just of late talk about how impermanence and how a thing isn't a thing. So the same way that I am not my hand, I am not my heart, I'm not my mind, I'm a collection of all of these things. Or a chair is just a collection of things. If your perception changes to a point where you don't consider yourself a person with a uterus or a person with external organs, if you think of yourself as just existing in this world without gender, without all the bits and pieces that make us who we are, then you can kind of erase that little bit. If you attain that level of understanding, I wouldn't necessarily think of myself as female anymore, which would now make the allowance for me to be enlightened. Because apparently, the fact that I'm female doesn't make much difference between me having a hand or having a uterus. That is not who I am. So I'd like to think that if I can just break myself down into all the different little pieces and let it float away, I don't have to be a woman. I don't have to be a man. I don't have to be disabled. It's all a matter of perception. That's what I think.
Yeah.
Great. That's a really good interpretation. So with that, I'm going to move on. Thank you. So the next sutra that we'll talk about very briefly is the Contemplation or Meditation Sutra. The name for it in Japanese is Busetsu Kanmu Ryojuko, and the translation of it is that Sutra of the Contemplation of the Buddha of Immeasurable Life. So this again was a sermon that was given on Vulture's Peak by the historical Buddha, And this is a really interesting sutra. If anybody has an opportunity to read it, it's quite interesting. So, because it focuses mostly on meditation and how to practice meditation. In fact, most people have described it as a how-to manual of how to do various kinds of meditation. So that's basically the summary of it. But in that sutra, it talks about a really famous story, and I'll see if I can summarize it quickly. It talks about the story of Queen Vaidehi and her husband King Bimbamsara and their son Ajatasattu. So Ajatasattu, this is a really tragic story, but basically Ajatasattu was this prince. The king and the queen were having trouble conceiving, so they consulted a wise man. The wise man said, when that arahat over there, that wise man over there dies, you will be able to conceive. His next life will be your baby. So the queen and the king said, this wise man kept living longer and longer, and he said, well, we can't wait for this wise man to die. So they actually murdered the arahat, the wise man, right? And then Queen Vaidehi got pregnant, gave birth to Ajatasattu, and the tragic thing is then that wise man who gave them the advice said, whoa, that's a really bad omen. That's very bad karma. You killed an arahat to have a baby. So what's going to happen is that baby is going to come back and either hurt you or kill you, right? So the queen and the king panic. They throw the baby out the window, out of a tower. He lands, and he survives. And he has one broken baby finger. That's the only thing that he suffered. So that's what Ajatasattu is, broken finger. So anyway, so the prince comes back. He's raised by another family, and then he claims his throne. And then he throws King Bimbasara and Queen Vaidehi, the king first, in prison. And he says, I'm going to seek my revenge. I'm going to make you die. And he's going to make him die by starvation. Right? So he throws him in prison, doesn't give him access to any food or water, but the king keeps living. And the prince can't figure out, well, how is it that he's alive for months? And then he finds out that Vaidehi, his mother, has been secretly sneaking food in to the king. So when Ajatasattu finds this out, he throws his mother, Queen Vaidehi, in prison as well. The king dies, okay? And then Queen Vaidehi says, oh my goodness, what a tragic tale my life is. So then she prays to the Buddha and says, how can I get out of this suffering? I want to be born into a place free of sorrow and afflictions, right? And so this whole sutra, the meditation sutra, was the Buddha coming to Vaidehi in prison and saying, okay, if you really want out of this world of suffering, then you have to learn to meditate, and these are the ways to meditate. So that's why it's a how-to manual on how to meditate. But the interesting thing is that it talks about 13 stages of meditation, so how to meditate in 13 different stages. It talks about 9 types of beings, right? So there's the high beings, the middle beings, and the low beings. Okay, we're all in the low beings. And the high beings is divided into the highest of the high, the middle of the high, and the lowest of the high. And the middle is similarly broken up into the highest of the middle of the middle, the lowest, etc., right? And what the summary of the Contemplation Sutra says is that for everyone, and different beings have different abilities, right? So the highest of the high, they can meditate and do all these 13 stages. But it's said that the lowest of the low, that's me, the only way that I can meditate is just to recite the name of the Buddha, to say Namo Amida Butsu. So saying the Nembutsu is the only way that the lowest of the low can gain birth in the Pure Land or enlightenment, right? And so that's the summary or the conclusion of that sutra.
Get rid of this.
Great. So these are some of the contemplations. We won't go through them all, but it's number 9. That is the one that's the most important in the Contemplation Sutra. So it said the contemplation of the Amida, thinking about him or reciting his name, is the way that the lowest of the low can actually gain enlightenment, right? All of these others are for higher beings than me, But the lowest of the low, all you have to do is just think about the name, think about the Buddha, contemplate on it, right? So that's what he taught to Queen Vaidehi. So the story is quite interesting because it goes through that terrible tragedy, but then it talks about the contemplations, how to contemplate, but that ultimately the contemplation of the Buddha is the best way, or the only way. The last sutra is called Amida Sutra, or the smaller Skavativyuha Sutra, Sutra on Amida Buddha, or in Japanese, Busetsu Amida Kyo. And it's the only sutra that we actually chant in entirety at our sermons, because it's short, because it only takes, 8 minutes to chant Amida Kyo? All the other sutras, if we can chant them, and they do in Japan, but the larger sutra takes about 4 hours to chant, I think they say. Yeah. So if anybody wants to come, we can do that someday, chant for 4 hours. So the smallest Sukhavativyuha Sutra was delivered by Buddha, again, and it's called the Spontaneous Sutra. All other sutras that were written by the Buddha were in response to a question that someone asked them, right? So the Buddha would have his disciples, and the disciples would say, well, Buddha, what about this? And then he would give a sermon on that. This is the only one, supposedly, that the historical Buddha gave without anybody asking him a question. He said, okay, I want to tell you guys about this, and this is really important. And in it, it basically describes the Pure Land of where this Skavati, this Pure Land of Amida. And in it, it talks about if you recite the Buddha's name even once in your lifetime, then you are guaranteed birth in the Pure Land, right? So basically, it's a summary, but all three of the sutras then focus on the idea that saying the name or contemplating the Buddha or entrusting your heart and mind to the Buddha is your guarantee for birth in the Pure Land. So those are the three main sutras: the largest sutra, the meditation or contemplation sutra, and the smaller sutra, or Amida Sutra. We do have English translations of the sutra in our library, so if anybody wants to have a look at them. As I said, the beginning of them, the first quarter of all of the sutras, is a long tale about where it was given, who it was given to, and all the people in attendance, so you can probably skip that part. And then the middle section is usually the meat of the sutras, and then the end, it talks about how these sutras came to be, and what happened about the sutras after the Buddha told the stories about the sutras. So those are their three main sutras. Does anybody have any questions about the sutras or the three main sutras?
Go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead, Mark.
When the sutras, the sutras are his sermons or his speeches, but somebody was writing down who all was there, or they just somehow remembered it?
Yes, so that's the big question, is they weren't written down, they were memorized. It's said that the majority of the memorization was done by a fellow by the name of Ananda, one of his disciples. And it's interesting because it's said that Ananda had the hardest time becoming enlightened of all of his disciples, and yet he was supposed to have a phenomenal memory, which doesn't quite gel. So it is said that all of his sutras, his sermons, were memorized, especially by Ananda. And in that first gathering, after the Buddha died, Ananda told all of the sutras to all of the disciples. And the way that they memorized it is by chanting them. Right? So that's why all of these, like Amida Kyo is a chant. It's a chant specifically about what the Buddha said. So that's why it includes things like who was there, where did it happen, and all that. So it's not just the Buddha's words, it's actually sort of a prologue or a preamble about the sutra as well. But that's in theory how it happened, is that it was chanted and memorized and then passed on through the ages. Okay. Val, you had a question?
It might be a dumb question, but is Sambujo the larger sutra?
I'm sorry?
Sambujo, is that?
Oh, sorry. So, yes, so there's two other sutras chants that we do, Sambujo and Jusege, and they are small sections of the larger sutra, right? So if you look at the larger sutra, in its entirety. There's our small sections that venerate the Buddha that actually gave advice to Dhammakara, so that's Sambujo. And Jusege is veneration of the Buddha attaining Buddhahood.
Fascinating. I didn't know any of this.
Yeah, so we do a number of different chants, sutras, and in theory they were the words of the Buddha that we chant, but most of what we do is just short segments of, otherwise we'd be there at temple for 4 or 5 hours, which people don't like.
Roland,
Yes.
all these masters talk about enlightenment, and you just said a minute ago that some people have more difficulty becoming enlightened.
Yes.
Well, who's making the decision?
Of who's enlightened?
Like, what is enlightened? How do you know it? Like, are you enlightened?
Yes. So the easy answer is no one knows, right? Enlightenment is supposed to be a state where you are one with the ultimate reality, the ultimate life force, that you see life as it really truly is, right? But who's to say? And many people in history have claimed to be enlightened. There are many, for example, kings in Korea and China. The Empress Wu, for example, she said, "I am the Buddha Maitreya." She actually claimed to be the next Buddha. And then, her subjects would have to say, "Yes, I believe that," or "No, we don't." In fact, the Buddha statues in a place called, there's a grotto in China where there's this huge Buddha statue, and it's Maitreya Buddha, but it's with the face of Empress Wu, right? So she actually had this huge statue made. So, who's to know? Who's to say? It is said that when you come upon an enlightened person, that you recognize them instantly as being enlightened. And there is, for example, in various sutras, including Amida Sutra, description of 32 characteristics of an enlightened being, right? So they have long ears, they have a tuft of hair in their forehead. That's all mythology, I guess, is what I would claim it as. But ultimately, who knows? You could be enlightened, and I may not recognize you as being an enlightened being.
Well, yeah, and it could be for an instant that you're enlightened.
Sure.
And then,
yeah, and then you're no longer enlightened in the state. So I don't know the answer to that. Any other? Yeah, take it till you make it. Brenda, go ahead.
I was going to just say that now that we got down to the importance of an entrusting heart and the Nembutsu, what is the place, going back to the intro session, where you learn about the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the Six Paramitas? What place of importance does that have for us as practicing Buddhists?
Ooh, good question. So ultimately, Jodo Shinshu Buddhists would say that following the Eightfold Path or following the Six Paramitas is impossible. That we as human beings born with our egos and our 3 poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance cannot follow the 6 perfections of the Eightfold Path. That it's impossible for us to do that. And so the evolution of Pure Land Buddhism and Jodo Shinshu in particular was saying that because we recognize that we are limited, Bombu, imperfect beings, we have to rely on another power, the compassion of the Buddha, in order to gain that state, gain that enlightenment. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, right? So that's an addition that people have made, saying that, okay, well, if we can't do it, then let's not even try. It's important to try. It's important to make an effort to be kind, have gratitude, be compassionate, all those things, to try But the key word is try, right? We try, recognizing that we're not going to be able to fulfill those things perfectly. We try, but in the end, we have to rely on the compassion of the Buddha. I don't know if does that answer your question? So all of those things are important. The Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and the Six Paramitas, because it gives us a guide to try. But the Jodo Shinshu understanding is that none of us can do it perfectly, and so we have to rely on another power. Did that answer your question, Brenda?
Yeah, but geez, it's so complex. Hey, like, okay, then we always talk about gratitude, the importance of gratitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not easy, that's for sure. Other questions people have?
I was just going to make a statement to that, though, because I think it also depends why you practice Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. If you're practicing it because you're actually hoping to attain enlightenment, or if you're just kind of practicing Jodo Shinshu Buddhism because you want a more the life that you're living here while you're living it is, you want it to be, I guess, as strong or as positive on the others around you, as opposed to, I'm doing it because I'm trying to reach enlightenment. I'd rather know that I'm, like the Dana, that I'm doing like the different things from the Golden Chain and the Sixth Paramita I'm doing to hopefully make my life here and those around me right now a little bit better than potentially not being better.
And I think, we talked about the Bodhisattva path, but that was a major shift in Buddhist thought, is why are we doing this? Like, why are we on this earth? What is the purpose in our life? And the original idea was to gain enlightenment for myself. I want to get to become this perfect being. And the evolution is that, no, I shouldn't be just doing this for myself, but I should be doing this for all other sentient beings. And then the ultimate evolution, or the next evolution with Jodo Shinshu is that I'm not doing it for myself to help others, but we are doing it together. Right? I'm going to talk about this in the last session, but just to give my idea, I think that a religion, a spiritual path, needs to be one that helps you become the best person that you can be, right? I think ultimately that's the goal of religion, to try and help you live a life in a way, and I'll ask you to answer that in a second, Tomiko, in a way that helps guide you so that you can try to become the best person you can be. And I truly believe that Jodo Shinshu does that, right? That gives you a basis for living your life, which is to be grateful and to be compassionate. And that's what a religion should be about. So when I look at my sermons on a day-to-day basis, sometimes I don't do this, but I really try to think about, well, how is this teaching, this story, this thing I'm talking about, how does that help me become a better person by understanding it? Right? And I think really that's the basis of what religion should be. I mean, that's my own interpretation. I could be wrong. But
it's like Nikon therapy. You can be doing this because the secret of life is to be happy. And if you follow this practice, then if you're living a life of gratitude, free of judgment, you're probably going to feel a lot better about yourself, and that means to be grateful to all the people around you that are contributing to the life that you have.
I think Nikon therapy as well also brings an awareness of how you're impacting the people around you. Right?
Yeah. So it's kind of selfish as well.
Yeah. There's this theory that you have to heal yourself before you can heal others. You have to be well in yourself in order to. So, some would say, well, you have to try and gain enlightenment for yourself before you can help other beings. But it's this whole notion of, the purpose, or why are you here? What's the purpose in your life? And is it to help others or to be part of a group that's going along a path? you know, what's the focus? Is it you? Is it others? I don't know.
What you said about religion.
Mm-hmm.
We had encounter sessions at in Kyoto, and there was a priest who led our group, and I didn't speak Japanese that well. This was way in the early 60s, and I had forgotten his name, but he was a wonderful priest from Kyushu, and he mentioned the same thing. He said the best way you can spread Buddhism, for example, in the largely Judeo-Christian world at that time. That was my question. What's the best way? He said, he quoted the fourth paramita, Vira, do the best you can, all you do. What more can you ask of a person?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. So I think, you know, basically a religion has to help you in that regard to be the best person that you can be, and if it isn't, yeah, I would really wonder if it's a religion. But anyways, that's my own interpretation. Any other questions, comments, things people want to ask? Did anybody think of anything else? Not that we have a lack of topics for next week, but anything else that you want to talk about? Oh, go ahead, Brenda.
So also, as we get to this stage in the getting to Jodo Shinshu, it's often been criticized as like people misunderstanding it. When you get to reciting the Nembutsu and an entrusting heart and Amida Buddha, and they say, "Oh, you're the Christian Buddhists." I think that there's sometimes a misunderstanding.
Yeah, because so I'll try to clarify that a little bit. It's often said that reciting the Nembutsu is like a prayer, right? You're saying Nam Amida Butsu, you're reciting the name, but it really is well spelled out that it's not meant to be a petitionary prayer. That you don't say the Nembutsu in hopes that you're going to get better grades, or you're going to get a raise, or you're going to win the lottery, or anything like that. It really is meant as an expression of gratitude for the teachings, for being able to hear the teaching and be able to have exposure to the Buddha and his teachings. And so it's a little bit different than the prayer that I think most Christians would think about. But anyways.
I know when we've had family gatherings, and you know the Catholic side of the family and the Buddhist side, and they come to a Buddhist funeral and they say, well, your Buddhism is exactly like Christianity. You believe that when you die, you go to a Pure Land, to a heaven. So how is that any different from Christianity?
Right. I mean, that one's the easier one for me to answer, because in Buddhist understanding, we don't stay in heaven, right? As soon as we're born in the Pure Land, we come back to help all other beings. So we don't get to sort of relax and bathe in the beauty of heaven.
And of course, we don't have the other side. We don't have somebody judging us when we pass and saying, okay, you go left and you go right.
Yeah, right.
You know, up and down.
And that's particularly important in Buddhism, is that it doesn't matter what you've did in your life, as bad as you could have been, that you will go to the Pure Land.
Well, isn't that the same in the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
You just go and confess it all to the priest.
And it'll be all undone.
Yeah. Yes, maybe. But yeah, there's no condition of acceptance.
To me, the big difference is nobody's telling me what to do. It's on me.
And that's a nice segue into next week, right? We were
And
talking about.
The other thing is that some of the big concepts in Buddhism, like emptiness, are there for you to discover yourself. You think about it, think really deeply, you're going to get there. Where the big concepts in Christianity require that you are putting a belief into something that you can't necessarily touch with your mind. You have to just believe that this is.
Or Islam, where you have to submit to the will of Allah. Whatever old man that happens to be at the time.
Well, I I'm really cautious about criticizing other religions because I don't really know and understand other religions to the point where I can. I just know that with Buddhism and in Jodo Shinshu, the whole concept of unconditional acceptance by witness compassion is very central. So, yeah. So thanks everybody. We will close with Gassho or Nembutsu. Nama we don't. Nama I don't. Nama we don't. So thanks everybody.
Thank
That was okay. Lots of material to cover.
Everyone, that was really good.